On the last episode of Vibrant Performance TV, I spoke about material selection and preparation for our turbo manifold. Now it's time to weld our collector together. Let's go. In this installment of the rear-wheel drive CRX video series, we'll be building a turbo manifold collector. There's a lot of good information and tips, so hang in there. This is the original turbo manifold that was in the car. I've chosen to replace this manifold. The main reason behind that is I want to move the turbo forward. Now, by moving the turbo forward, it's going to give me a little more room for my downpipe, and allow me to be able to pull my catalytic converter out from underneath the car and put it kind of at the bottom of my firewall. So it'll give me a little more ground clearance underneath the car, which is something that I'm trying to do. So another reason why I'm replacing this manifold is I have a little bit of a creep issue with the wastegate and the way it's routed on this collector. So in my new manifold, I'm going to have a provision where it comes off the collector and leads into the wastegate a little bit better. So it'll encourage flow to go into the wastegate to help control that boost. So the reason I start down in the middle is when you're welding stainless, if you weld two pieces together, and you're welding on top, they want to draw together like this. So if I start out here like this on the outside, it's going to want to draw these two pipes towards each other like that. And I don't want that to happen. So I gotta make nice strong tacks, but starting on the inside is gonna make these guys wanna all kind of draw in a little bit, but because I have my inlet flange tack welded on the bottom, it's gonna prevent that. But keep in mind, if I go from the outside to the inside, when I get to the inside, all four of these points of that collector are going to want to draw in and then actually be drawing away from each other, and you'll end up with a gap in the middle there that you don't want to have to deal with at the end of your collector. So ideally, start in the middle, work your way out. That's just the way I do it. Okay, so I'm ready to start building my collector. I have a heatsink, a mild steel 1/2 inch thick T3 turbo inlet flange, and my 4-into-1 merge collector designed for the T3 flange. Now, first thing I need to do is material preparation. I need to break this apart. I need to take this to the belt sander, and then we're ready to start welding. So to break apart my collector, I'm just using a simple die grinder, and I'm just gonna break apart. If you look at this collector, there's a total of 6 tack welds holding the whole thing together. So there's 2 in the middle here, and then there's 4 around the outside on the bottom. So if I keep these 2 together, I'm going to want to split this one and this one so that it comes apart in 2 halves, and then I can get access to those other tack welds to split. So I've got these apart. I'm going to label them on the inside where I'm not going to be cleaning, so I know how it goes back together. So now I'm ready to clean these. And also add my bevel onto this end so that when I have a pipe come into there, I can have a nice fillet to fill with weld. You'll notice that there's 4 pieces, 2 are the same, and then there's 2 other that are matching as well. When you tack these together, you want to make sure that you make 2 halves that are going to be able to fit together. So this is not what you want right here. This is going to go across the long side of my flange, and this is what it would look like to go across the short side of my flange. So all I have to do to fix that is just switch these 2 around. I want to make sure that both halves are matching, and then I can put them back together without an issue. Otherwise, I'm going to have to break that apart and then start again. Okay? So when I tack these, I tack them together 1 pair at a time, and just tack on the bottom and then closer to the top, and then I'll put both halves together and put them together. So when I tack weld these together, I'm just gonna hold it by hand and try and keep a little bit of pressure, pressing it down into the table, and that's gonna make sure that it stays nice and flat so that when I go to put these two together, it won't be an issue. I never ever weld these separate like this. The reason I never do that, I'll only weld it once it's all tacked together. But if I do this weld down this seam, it's gonna make these pipes want to draw in towards that heat that's created by that weld, and you're gonna end up with a gap on the inside. Now I'm gonna add maybe just a little tack on the inside of this point before I put the two halves together. So now my two halves are ready to go together. Everyone does this a little bit differently. I like to stand it up and try and align those edges nice and straight. And then I'm gonna check and make sure that it's nice and flat. It doesn't rock too much, but even after I tack that, I can even take this back over to the belt sander and make that nice and flat. So I'm gonna add a couple more tacks on the inside, and then we'll be ready to tack weld it to our flange. So I'm also going to add a tack weld down in the middle of where all the 4 points meet. The reason I do that is to help prevent those from pulling away from each other when I'm welding the collector together.
If you do find that you have a small gap where your 4 points meet in the middle of your collector, a nice trick is to use a pair of needle nose vice grips to draw that gap and close it before you begin welding.
I want to have it so that my filler is going to be added from the side that has a deeper joint, right? So it allows me to get my filler down in there a little bit easier, whereas if I come from this side, it's a steeper angle and I don't have as good access to that point down on the bottom.
You will need to pull the tungsten out of your cup on your torch when you do the weld down in the middle of the collector. Try to do this in a vertical position so that all the argon, which is heavier than oxygen, will stay around that weld pool to help shield it from oxidizing too soon. Another option is to use an extended cup.
So I've tack welded my collector together, being careful to make sure that everything's lined up. I've taken it over to the belt sander and made the bottom of it flat so it sits nice and flat on my turbo inlet flange. I'm ready to tack weld the collector to the flange now. I'm just going to tack weld it on all 4 seams, and then I'm going to be ready to weld it. Now when I line this up, you just want to look inside and make sure that everything's aligned properly inside, looks even. If you're really particular, you could even take a Sharpie and mark the inside of the port of your flange on the center line on each side, and you can look inside and make sure that that seam is aligned with the center line that you've marked with a Sharpie marker.
Now when I'm tack welding the flange and the collector together, I'm using a 309L filler rod, and the reason I'm going with that choice for filler is because my turbo flange is mild steel and my collector is stainless steel, and that's the best choice for filler when you're combining mild steel and stainless together. I'm using a little bit thicker filler rod for this joint as well because I'm welding thicker material with a 1/2 inch thick steel turbo flange.
So now I'm all set to get my purge setup going, and then I can start welding. I'm just trying to fill these holes with some tin foil to help try and prevent my argon from escaping my collector as I weld it together. So I've got this all set up. my back purge, so that I'm gonna fill this collector with argon. So it's shielded on the inside. So my weld pool, when it gets full penetration through these seams, I'm not gonna end up with any kind of sugar on the inside of this weld. It'll make it a much stronger weld, and you shouldn't have any cracks form in your collector when you're done. So what I've done with this particular setup is I've just stuffed each runner with a bit of tin foil because it's going to be resistant to the heat. It's not going to melt. There are plugs you could also put in there, and then I'm just feeding my argon in through there. Now, our particular setup on our bottle, we have a dual valve on a single bottle. You can also do a dual bottle if you have two bottles. You could run one just for your purge and one just for your torch. But we have two valves on a single bottle, each with their own flow adjustment, so we can prioritize to the torch or to the back purge. All right, now when I start welding this, I'm gonna start down in the middle and work my way to the outside, because I don't want those 4 points to draw away from each other. If you start on the outside, there's a chance that that could possibly happen. But I've also got these tack welded together, so that shouldn't be an issue. So I've got my tungsten extended out of my cup, so I can reach down in there. If you do have an extended cup, it's a little more convenient to reach down into that collector to make that weld. So now I'm ready to continue welding along the outside of my seams on my runners. You can choose to weld continuing from the inside to the outside, or from the outside back to the middle, or you could even start from the outside and weld to the middle. It's all personal preference and what works best for you. I've had good results doing it this way, so I'll stick with
What seems to be working?
Everyone has their own preferences on how they like their welds to look. Some guys like big ripples, some guys like little ripples. Personally, I like smaller ripples because it leaves a cleaner edge on your weld.
And when you have a nice clean edge, it's going to be less prone to cracking. Each one of those ripples is a stress riser. And the larger they are, the more chance you have of a crack forming out of one of those crevices between the ripples. So the smoother you can keep your weld, the less chance you'll see a crack form in it.
And that's why I like to dab frequently to keep that outside edge of the weld nice and straight, smooth, so no crack is going to want to form on it.
You also want to turn your post flow up and hold your cup over top of your weld until the post flow is complete, to prevent that oxygen from getting at that hot molten steel and oxidizing it. The oxidization, it creates the pretty colors, but it's actually contamination, and you don't want it in your weld. You actually want to remove all that color. It's gonna make a weld that will last longer, and it won't have any corrosion. It'll be less likely to corrode.
So I like to rest my hand against something when I'm welding. I might have like a V-block or something like that. Here I'm gonna use my torch holder, because I want to just move as little as possible. The more steady I can keep my hands while I'm welding, the more consistent results I'm gonna get with my weld. I'm also resting my filler hand against the edge of the table here. Sometimes I may even add another block here if I wanna keep a nice steady hand. The more steady, I tuck my elbows in when I weld as well. Just, you know, your arms are out here, you're more likely to shake or make a movement that you don't intend to. And that's when you end up with inconsistencies in your weld. Okay, so I'm ready to weld my flange to my collector. My runners are all completely welded. Now when I weld my flange and collector together, I'm going to do 4 stitch welds, and I'm going to run them across, just across the seam on the flat on each side, and I'm going to leave these radiuses out here unwelded. The reason I'm leaving these unwelded is because the radius on the pipe is an exact match of the radius on the corner of that flange. So I want to take this off of that after I let it cool down, take it off my heat sink plate, and I'm going to take a couple of ball peen hammers and I'm going to massage those corners to pull those corners out so that they match the flange, and then it'll help promote flow into the flange a little bit better and into my turbo. So after I massage those out a little bit with the ball peen hammer, I'll put it back on my heatsink plate and I'll continue welding.
So when I'm doing this weld, I'm using again the 309L filler, a little bit thicker than what I was using for the runners. So I'm using more amperage when I weld this together.
The reason for that is the flange is quite a bit thicker, so I'm trying to focus more of my arc on my thicker flange, and I'm trying to fill on the side of my runners
to keep them nice and cool.
Now we're ready to break this apart. Take those corners out a bit and then weld it all up. We just got to let this cool down first before we break it apart, because it's going to be warm for a little bit while. I don't want to take this apart too early before that cools down, because if you don't allow it to cool down sufficiently, it can spring out on you and you'll end up with a warped flange. So I've removed my purge setup, I removed my heatsink plate, and I'm ready to just massage these corners a little bit so the radius of the runner is a little bit closer match to the radius on the corners of my turbo inlet flange. Now the reason I do that is just so that there's a nice smooth transition, so that exhaust gas, when it comes out of the collector, goes through that flange, it's going to be as smooth as possible. I could probably just weld these corners, but I'm going to end up with a little bit of a step. I want to remove that step before I perform that weld so it's nice and smooth. So you can see, if you want to compare, you can see that radius has been moved out a little bit to closer match our radius on the flange, and this one I still have to do yet. You got to be careful though when you do this, because I want to try and not mark up the face of my flange. If I do, I can just take it over to the belt sander and clean it up a bit. So I'm happy with how that radius is a closer match now. It'll smooth out a little bit when I weld the inside of this flange to the inside of the collector. So I just need to finish my corner radius welds, then I can let this cool down, pull it back off of our heatsink plate, and then weld the inside where the flange meets the collector.
So when I weld,
when I try to do, you want a nice consistent result, I always try to plan it out, move my hand across where I'm going to be moving the torch as I weld, before I strike the arc. That way, I know I'm going to be able to complete that
all in one pass without having to stop.
Before I perform the final weld on the collector on the inside, I'll take a die grinder with a carbide burr and quickly just clean up that lip between the flange and the runners of the collector. This will also remove any scale on the inside of our flange so that we get a nice clean weld. Once the inside weld is completed, it's a good idea to put your heatsink plate on while it's still hot and tighten it down so you don't end up with a warped flange. Now that the turbo collector is completely welded, it's time to bolt it up to our turbo, place it inside the engine bay, and begin mocking up each of our runners to complete the manifold. Be sure to join me in the next episode of Vibrant Performance TV, where I am going to be discussing wastegate placement and its importance, and turbo manifold construction on the manifold of the turbo rear-wheel drive CRX.